For our COBT friends, it's Maynard, Mike, and Arjun here with something truly exceptional that we have been looking forward to for a very long time now. Our guest today is General David Petraeus. He's obviously an acclaimed American general, a four-star general, 37 years in the service of the nation, most identified, I believe, with his commanding roles in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's now the chairman of the KKR Global Institute. He's been doing that for 10 plus years. And so he's got a perspective on the world that is truly unique, a perspective on America that is truly unique. He's also just written a new book. It's called Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 through to Ukraine. We're delighted to get to visit with you, General Petraeus, and we want to say a special thank you to our friend Bill Albrecht, who connected you with us. And so let me just say welcome, thank you, and we can't wait to visit with you.
Great to be with you, Maynard, and thanks to my great classmate and good friend, Bill.
Well, before we jump in with the general, Mike, what would you tell us about the markets today?
You know, Maynard, I tell you, the markets are really ugly today. Just like in September, the markets were down pretty substantially. In September, we're starting off pretty poorly in October. And a lot of it is because of rates, right? 10-year rates over the last 2 days are up around 20 basis points. So we're at 4.8% yield on the 10-year. And the other thing we've been talking about over the last, say, 2 or 3 months was the inverted yield curve. And we've gone from the curve being inverted by 100 basis points to now it's only inverted by 35 basis points. So we've had a lot of move in yields over the last couple of weeks. And so that's really kind of factoring into equity markets at this point in time. So a couple of things we want to really talk about too is, you know, we're talking about that energy, you know, equity markets are really under pressure. Bond markets are under pressure because of yields. But from a commodity standpoint, what we're seeing here, it looks like crude oil, WTI, is stabilized in the $89 and $90 per barrel range. And there's a couple events that are going to happen here in the next 2 days. One is going to be the OPEC meeting tomorrow, October 4th OPEC meeting. We don't expect them to reverse their cuts at all at this meeting. If they were to do something along those lines, we think oil prices would be hit pretty severely. So that's pretty consensus that they're not going to do anything. The second date to remember is November 26th. That's a formal OPEC meeting. Now, I think market participants still think they're not going to cut at that meeting, but that's not 100%. So that's something that people are going to be watching quite closely too. The second event we talk about is tomorrow as well. Tomorrow we're going to have the DOE numbers, and everyone's going to be looking at Cushing inventory levels. As you all know, Cushing inventory levels have come down quite substantially. They're pretty bone dry at this point in time. And it looks like consensus for tomorrow is looking for a slight draw in crude inventory. So again, markets are going to be really focused on those two events over the next day or two. The other thing we really want to talk about, and really there are two seminal moments last week that happened in the market. And those two seminal moments would be, first, NEP, which is NextEra Energy Partners, their stock price plunged last week. And the second thing would be the IEA's updated net zero report out to 2050. So let's talk about NEP first. NEP is really is one of the cream of the crops of the renewable growth in the U.S. And so they're one of the best of the best. They're really a bellwether, and their stock got pounded last week. And the reason why is the company lowered their growth rate from their distribution growth rate from 12 to 15% to around 5 to 8%. And the main reason given was that higher interest costs, higher financing costs. And so this bellwether is reducing its growth rate quite substantially. It tells you what's going to happen to other companies that are in the renewables business. And so a couple things. One, stock is down about 55% in the last week or so. Its parent, which is NEE, is down around 25%, and they've shed around $30 billion in market cap for that company. Now, if you look at the utility sector as well over the last week and change, it's shed roughly $100 billion in market cap. And so this is a big, big deal. And if you look at utilities, they're down around 21% year to date. That's the second biggest decrease in the last 20 years. The last time this happened was in 2008. We know what kind of happened around that time period. And so the thing we want to pass along to you guys on NEP is not to single them out. We saw Ørsted a couple weeks ago. Their stock got pounded by 30 to 40% because of PPAs and stuff of that nature. What we're saying is if you're an energy renewables company, energy transition company, and you're generating negative free cash flow over the next couple of years, or you have big financing needs, you're going to be in real trouble. So NEP is not going to be the only company that has something like this come out. The second seminal moment that we want to talk about is this IEA net zero report. And the reason we want to mention it is because they doubled down on dumb. In this report, they talked about basically demand by 2030 is going to be down for fossil fuels around 25%, and by 2050, about 80%. Now, this is just as unrealistic. This is ridiculous. This is, I don't know what environment they're talking about. But if you look at what I just talked about, higher financing costs, these renewable companies dialing back growth rates, and the IEA basically telling you that, by 2030, you're going to have to spend roughly $4.5 trillion annually, up from $1.8 trillion now annually. That is massively inflationary. That's just going to weed out a lot of capital. That's going to be higher interest rates. So what I think is going to happen is the IEA's goals are unachievable. And the goals for fossil fuel demand that IEA lays out for a 25% reduction by 2030 is ridiculous. We think the demand for fossil fuels is going to grow well beyond 2030. And guess what? That's a good thing, and that's a realistic thing. So with that, Maynard, we'll hand it back to you.
Okay, great. Arjun, anything you would add as we jump in with the general?
Thanks, Maynard. So I wanted to talk about as well some of the correction we're seeing in new energies names, a whole host of different sectors, whether it's resi solar, offshore wind, some of the renewables names, et cetera, and how that ties to what I really highlighted as a major risk, which are the policy prescriptions that are coming out of things like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which essentially is telling both capital markets, financial firms, and insurance companies, you should lend in part based on an emissions finance metric. And it's one of the biggest risks to, I think, having a healthy overall energy environment. It is taking the approach that we should motivate much faster investment in new energies and disincentivize essentially investments in traditional energy. And of course, when we're talking about traditional energy here, when you look at the companies, the financial firms that would be part of something like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, they're going to be mostly Western-oriented European and US banks and insurers. And they, of course, are going to finance Western, US, European, some Canadian oil and gas companies. And the real threat here is that you're forcing capital into one sector while you're trying to motivate taking capital out of traditional energy in particular. And when you look at the kind of the boom bust nature of so much of energy, it's true for traditional energy. We saw it with the shale names. We've seen it over 100 years of this sector, boom bust. You're starting to see that as well. And it's not a surprise. New energies is more capital intensive in most cases than is traditional. And you're seeing boom bust there. So imagine you're in a world where, as a bank or a financial company, you're under significant pressure to show that you're, quote, Paris aligned. How does this make any sense? How does it make sense to force our financial services companies and our insurance companies to really redirect investment towards a newer area in the name of transition, in the name of emissions only? That, to me, is not a healthy approach to lending, capital markets, and insurance. And it really runs the risk of unfavorable and unfortunate loans and policies going towards the new energy names and insufficient capital, insufficient insurance in traditional areas. In some respects, it's a slow burn. These timelines are measured over many years, in many cases, decades, but make no mistake, that pressure is there. And you're seeing it on the margin. You're seeing companies and insurers start to slowly back, especially in Europe, start to back away a bit from the traditional sector. And again, when you develop energy projects, they need to go at an appropriate pace. They need to go as the technology and the projects are ready. And when you rush, forcibly or otherwise, into any one particular area, again, this has been true in traditional energy. We're seeing it come true in the new energies areas. I think it's a big problem. So when we look at policy here, this idea that we're going to pick winners and force actions to be taken solely on the metric of emissions financed, I'm going to say, big problem. You're starting to see challenges, normal growing pains, quite frankly, but normal growing pains and challenges in the new energies areas. And there's a real risk that there's going to be underinvestment, underfinancing over the long term in the traditional energy space. And so we do have General David Petraeus here with us, and I'm excited to turn the conversation over to him. But we know the results of unfavorable energy policy. It is in part a contributing factor to geopolitical volatility in the world. And I will stand by my view, I think it's our view at Veriton, that the world is a safer, healthier, better place when we have a strong and profitable and growing American, Canadian, and ideally Western Europe traditional energy sector to go along with all the new stuff that is going to come, that should come, but at its own and appropriate pace. So let me stop there, Maynard. I'm as thrilled and excited as you are, and as I know Mike is, to speak with General Petraeus here. Back over to you.
Thank you so much, Arjun. Well, General Petraeus, you do have this new book coming out October 17th. We very much appreciate getting an advance copy so we could get smarter for today's conversation. Maybe one place to start is that the book is incredible. It talks about, as I mentioned, the title says it all, the evolution of warfare, 1945 through to Ukraine. What prompted you to write the book? And kind of what are your reflections now that you have completed it?
Well, it was my co-author who prompted me to write the book. I've known Andrew Roberts. He's one of the greatest contemporary historians, maybe the greatest biography. He is known for having written the best single-volume biography of Churchill. He's also done George III recently. He did Napoleon and a number of other history and books and biographies. I've done events with him on numerous occasions in the past. We hit it off, and he had this idea of writing this book about conflict and how it has evolved from 1945 to Ukraine. I'd done a dissertation at Princeton on Vietnam. I participated very, very substantially in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as you saw in the book, actually, the editor, after he read the usual writing of a chapter in the third person, he said, you were in Iraq from the invasion to the drawdown and the withdrawal of the combat forces as a 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, 4-star, and CIA director. You should write it in the first person and put an asterisk and explain why it is that those two chapters will be like that. It was really great fun. It was very intellectually stimulating. It was a lot of hard work. But what emerged from it most for me is just this recognition that in conflict, as in all other endeavors, I would submit, the critical element that typically has to be present for success is great strategic leadership. A strategic leader literally is the person at the very top. It can be civilian as well as military in a number of these different cases. It's the individual who has to get the big ideas right, the strategy, the overarching strategy. So you have to understand the context and the strengths and weaknesses and forces and factors and so forth. You then have to communicate the big ideas throughout the breadth and depth of the organization, the military force, but also to all other stakeholders, host nation partners, coalition members, White House, 10 Downing Street, you name it, America's mothers and fathers. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. It's what we normally think of as leadership, but that's the third task of a strategic leader. That's driving the campaign plan. It's providing the energy, the inspiration, the example, attracting great people, developing them, keeping them, inspiring them, incentivizing them, allowing those that aren't measuring up to move on to something else, how you spend your time, your battle rhythm, the metrics on which you focus that help you determine whether you're winning or losing, making progress or falling back. And then a fourth task that's sometimes overlooked, which is to determine how you need to refine the big idea so you can do it again and again and again. And this is very applicable in the business world. I can give you multiple examples. Netflix and so forth is a great case in particular. And Kodak is a sorry case because it's a case where a company had 2,000 patents on digital photography at the time that it was leading the world in film photography and services, but it failed to make the new big idea all about digital. It stuck with film too long, despite all of the expertise and, again, the patents and intellectual property that developed for digital photography. So you get the sense of this. And in war, perhaps this is even more important. And it was very instructive to be reminded of that. For what it's worth, I've had a number of academic appointments over the years after leaving government, having been the CI director. And in one of those, a non-resident fellow at Harvard at the Belfer Center, we actually distilled this intellectual construct for strategic leadership. If folks actually want to get into it in more detail, go to belfercenter.org and search for Petraeus on strategic leadership. There's a bunch of graduate students there that had actually worked for me in Iraq and Afghanistan and said they wanted to help me distill this, capture it. And it is a very, very good model, I think, which I explicitly used starting really when I was a 3-star between the 3 and 4-star tours in Iraq, and then really used it very explicitly ever after that. That element, again, strategic leadership. If the person at the top, I don't care how attractive he or she may be, again, inspirational, charismatic, eloquent, principled, all of these other qualities that you seek in a leader, if that individual doesn't have strategic judgment, can't get the big ideas right, it just doesn't work. Everything else is building on a shaky intellectual foundation.
That was such a great lead in to this whole thing. One of the things that strikes you, General, as you read the book is how useful it is for current leaders to go back through these conflicts and look at what took place. And so it's a real manual. I think maybe just to add one more thing, I thought the Vietnam chapter, or that whole segment, one of the takeaways there was obviously, it was like a slowly unfolding train wreck. You could see that how poorly it was going. But it looks like, as you replay it, the U.S. military thought hard about what had gone wrong and turned that into making itself the
very much so.
Yeah, so that was
very, very good point, actually. The Army did, in particular, Army and Marine Corps in particular, of course, the ground forces, those which frankly really suffered the most institutionally. We ground our non-commissioned officer corps into the rice paddies of Vietnam. We had a number of personnel practices that were flawed. Integrity came into question because of inflated body counts and a variety of other reports that were pencil whipped rather than actual reality on the ground. And the Army sat down and identified all this, as did the Marine Corps again, and then determined from that, with now a professional force, no longer a drafty Army, an all-volunteer force, and took steps to correct many, many of the issues that emerged that undermined the performance of our force in Vietnam, noting that, again, incredible fighting, great heroism, courage, sacrifice on the battlefield, all of this. Unfortunately, at the very top, until 1968, keeping in mind that we got involved after the French withdrawal in the mid-1950s, after their disastrous defeat at Dien Bien Phu, all the way from the mid-1950s until 1968, the strategic leadership, the 4-star on the ground in particular, really did not craft the right big ideas. And when the Vietnamese themselves said, we need to have a counterinsurgency campaign, it's about what's going on in the villages and the rice paddies and in the provinces, we said, oh, no. We learned in Korea, what you need is an army that looked like what we had in Korea. So we're going to help you form, X number of divisions in our image. That's what you need to prevent a North Vietnamese invasion. And of course, it wasn't an invasion. It was essentially insurgents. It was guerrillas. There were eventually main forces, but that would come a bit later. And so the big takeaway for me, and for what it's worth, having done my dissertation on Vietnam at about the 10-year mark after the withdrawal from Saigon in mid-1970s, I was struck by how much additional information there is, how much additional scholarship that really drives me to this conviction that we just did not have the big ideas right. And we also had a number of other flawed practices along with that. But as you know, we did learn from that. There's some great books about that. By the way, Prodigal Soldiers is one of them that captures the generation that fought in Vietnam largely as company commanders, majors, battalion commanders, brigade commanders, and then brought the Army out of that, did serious soul searching, identified the new big ideas for the Army as an institution, and really built the force that prevailed in Panama, in Desert Storm, and frankly performed so impressively in Iraq and in Afghanistan, despite, again, challenges that we had there, in some cases, again, because of, if you will, less than perfect strategic leadership, noting that in Afghanistan in particular, It took us 9 years after the invasion, after toppling the Taliban in late 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. It took us 9 years to get the inputs right. And I'm talking about here the right big ideas, so the right strategy, the right organizational architecture, the right level of resources, military, not quite, but almost, diplomats, spies, development workers, rule of law, et cetera, the right preparation of our forces, the right leaders, all of these elements that constitute inputs. And again, we squandered a number of years there, focusing instead the main effort on Iraq. And as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was often said, in Iraq, we do what we must. And I was part of the problem. I was demanding everything that we had during the surge. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. And until the surge was over, it succeeded, drove violence down by nearly 90%, and we could refocus on Afghanistan. We weren't able to devote, again, the attention, the priorities, the resources, and so forth to that war. But again, we also had to get the big ideas right for that. So this concept of strategic leadership is absolutely critical.
So just building on that Vietnam example, at the KKR Institute, do you find yourself encouraging organizations to pause and look back at
Absolutely.
painful chapters and really ask themselves what went
Absolutely.
wrong?
You bet. No question about it. In fact, I often actually give essentially seminars or conduct seminars for some of the sort of the smaller mid-sized companies that we own when they're at key inflection points. Maybe they're changing leadership quite substantially. They're searching for the new big idea, what have you. And I've done that dozens of times over the 10 years that I've been at KKR. And actually, we will assign them, review this website at the Belfer Center on the tasks of a strategic leader. We talk through it in a way generically. I'll give it an example. I'll give it in a second of Netflix, which is a wonderful one because Reed Hastings is one of the great strategic leaders. He has a model very similar to this, and we've discussed it over time. And then we'll actually sit down and talk about what are their big ideas, how are they performing, should they, search for new big ideas, how is it developing? And of course, within big ideas, there are smaller ideas as well. But just very quickly with Netflix, at least 4 incarnations of that firm that illustrate the power of this model, with Reed Hastings at the helm as the CEO. The first is the big idea is to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar, to undersell Blockbuster, which of course went away pretty quickly after that in competition. There's one left in Big Bend, Oregon. It refuses to let its Blockbuster die. It's become a tourist attraction for all of those of us who are nostalgic about renting movies from brick and mortar stores. So he works that through, communicates it, oversees the implementation, gets down here a couple of years later, said, how are we doing? Well, we're doing fine, but other people now are putting movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar. So what we need to do something new. What's the new big idea? He recognizes that broadband speeds are fast enough so we can download movies. And that's the new big idea. They work through that a couple of years later, while others are doing that now as well. And then he comes up with a massive new big idea, which was to create their own content, $100 million on House of Cards alone, and a number of other iconic series that we all binge watched in the early months of the COVID pandemic. And then the fourth big idea was to make major motion pictures. And he went out and bought a couple of major studios, 2 of them, in fact, not just one, and did that so well that they actually earned more Academy Award nominations 3 years ago, I believe it was, than any other movie studio. I did take issue with him. I noted that Brad Pitt playing General Stan McChrystal was just really not Brad's finest hour. He was awfully stiff. He didn't have a sense of humor. He marched around like a little toy soldier. And besides, I just couldn't get past the fact that Brad Pitt didn't play me. But in any event, you get the idea, the power of this model. And it's something that really jumped out of us in the book. We didn't start the book actually, in a sense, using this model as explicitly as we ended up doing. And we literally went back to the beginning, laid out the tasks of a strategic leader, gave a little bit more discussion than I am here, and then applied it in many of the subsequent case studies. And you see case studies where people did it really well. I mean, if you think of The Gulf War, for example, Desert Shield and Desert Storm, the very first meeting where the military was still not certain how to respond to Saddam Hussein's army having taken over Kuwait and occupying it. And President George H.W. Bush literally said, this will not stand. And they all said, oh, okay, that is a big idea. In other words, we are going to eject them, force them to withdraw, or we're going to push them out ourselves. We are going to liberate Kuwait. That is pretty clear. A military guy can understand that. And then we actually had very good strategic leadership in the military ranks, a combination of General Powell as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and of course, General Schwarzkopf as the theater commander of that operation. Number of other cases that we look at, the British in Malaya is a really interesting one. The Omani, the Dhofar rebellion that was put down by the Sultan of Oman, who comes back from Sandhurst, in the UK. A couple of years later, he overthrows his father. And then there's a British brigadier who works with him. And together they craft just a classic counterinsurgency campaign and execute it brilliantly. So it's really interesting to go back and look at these. But once again, you come back to that important element of leadership. And that is crucial, as you know, whether it's in the oil patch, in the energy services industry, any of the other industries in which KKR invests. And it seems to be really quite an enduring and important aspect. And for what it's worth, at KKR, we have not only invented new big ideas or come up with new, if you will, products, services, activities, initiatives. We've also ended some that just weren't materializing in the way that we had hoped. There's a continent in which we just won't invest anymore. We can't find the deal size in countries that have adequate rule of law, judicial system, security, political stability, and so forth. There's another large country in our own hemisphere where corruption is so endemic that we just won't invest there anymore. But beyond that, then we've again adopted other new products, new services, and constantly expanding. We also had a hedge fund of hedge funds. And there was an idea behind that you would get intellectual property or knowledge, insights into what the hedge funds that the hedge fund of hedge fund was investing in, which would inform our investing perhaps in next gen technology or some other spaces. It did okay. It did, reasonably well, but not as well as we wanted it to. And so we shut it down. Henry Kravis and George Roberts, of course, the co-founders that have been the co-CEOs until very recently. We've now had the transition to the next generation, Scott Nuttall and Joe Bay, brilliant leaders as well. And there's no reluctance there to acknowledge that something is not achieving what we hoped it would, and therefore we should end it. Just as we are constantly looking at developments in the world and what they tell us about relatively how much we should be investing in a certain place or what the restrictions are on investment there legally in terms of responsibility as an American-based firm, et cetera, et cetera. But it all comes back inevitably to the big ideas and to this process of communicating them, overseeing their implementation, and above all, determining how you need to refine them so that you can do it again and again successfully.
So one question for you, and you just touched on it. Sometimes something's not going well and you need to either stop or you need a course correction. That's a theme in the book. You see it in all these conflicts. When it's not going well, there's always someone that knows. There's someone who realizes we should change the strategy. And somehow, and I feel like this would apply to every company or organization watching this discussion, somehow good organizations get those change in course moments. They realize it, they talk about it, they find that person who has the new idea, and then they shift course. And the things that go disastrously are the things where they just don't change course for whatever reason, bad leadership, whatever it is, bad communication. How do you teach an organization to be like that and to course correct?
This is about culture. And I think that what you constantly strive to do, what I always sought to do in the organizations that I was privileged to lead in uniform at the agency and since leaving government, it's about building a culture that wants to be one of learning. And it's not enough just to say we want to learn, where it also has to have openness to reasoned dissent, disagreement, and so forth. But you also have to have formal action forcing mechanisms. So as part of overseeing the implementation of the big ideas, you are fostering a culture of learning. You are telling individuals that you want them to tell you if something's not going well in their view. But that's not enough. You have to have on your battle rhythm the events that force this to happen. To give you a handful of examples, every week I got together with all the 3 stars and above in Baghdad. And again, we would go around the table and they had to say, here's what we're learning and so forth. Once a month, we had all the 2 stars together, 2-star commanders and above. So this is the 8 division commanders and then all of those above them. They had to formally give 2 lessons that their organization had learned and or initiatives that they were pursuing that would be of value to all the others at that table. It wasn't optional. They had to do this. This was expected of them. It was part of the rhythm of that particular meeting. Once a month, I sat down with the heads of all of the lessons learned teams: Army, Marine Corps, Special Operations, Asymmetric Warfare Force, Counterinsurgency Center, all of these all over the battlefield. Each had a colonel in charge of them, and many people, again, embedded with our units fighting all over Iraq. And they would have an hour with me, which was the culmination of a process of capturing, distilling these lessons they identified, because they aren't learning the lessons. The organization has to learn the lessons. It doesn't learn a lesson until it's actually incorporated in the big ideas in some fashion, communicated, and then actually implemented, overseen by the strategic leader. So again, it's about fostering a culture, building a culture, reinforcing this culture of learning. In fact, in the counterinsurgency field manual, which was the intellectual foundation for what we did during the surge in Iraq, and I'll talk in a moment about that, because the big ideas there were literally 180 degrees different from what we've been doing before. The change leadership doesn't get any more than completely reversing what it is that you've been doing. But in that manual, we explicitly had, and I was the editor-in-chief, if you will, one of my my West Point classmates who had a PhD in this discipline and taught at the Army War College was the editor. We explicitly included in there the words that the side that learns the fastest typically prevails in this type of conflict. So we explicitly sought to be a learning organization, as every organization should be. But again, it's not enough to say it. You have to live it, and you have to inculcate it, and you actually have to have events that require the kind of reflection, the kind of input, and so forth. One other that I used to do twice a week minimum, right after the morning updates and all the other stuff that we did 7 days a week, I would get in an armored vehicle, go downtown Baghdad, or a helicopter to go farther, or fixed wing to go north or south. And I would then join a small unit, so a battalion, and then we'd go out on a patrol with a company. There's about 150 soldiers or so, usually less than that on the patrol. I wasn't there to get PowerPointed to death. They were allowed to brief me on, I think it was 5 slides on the hood of an armored vehicle. That was it. Just to show me, what their area of responsibility was, what we were going to do, some of the dynamics of that particular area. And then we'd go on patrol and we'd talk to our host nation partners, we'd talk to our coalition partners, we'd talk to civilians, sometimes we'd see the bad guys. But after that, I would come back to the patrol base or combat outpost, and I would sit with the company commanders only. These are captains. They were all at least on their second tour in Iraq. They're mature. They're not impulsive. They don't have off-the-wall ideas by that point in time. And they're the last level of leadership that knows every casualty by face, not by name or number. And I would lay that on them and remind them of that. So they had a huge rucksack of responsibility. And I said, this is your chance to tell your 4-star commander, the commander of the multinational force Iraq, something that is not going well, that's eating at you. And again, we had a formula for it. They had to give 1 sustain. In other words, even if our resources are drawn down, we have to continue doing this. And that would be indicative of stuff. And by the way, they couldn't me too. They had to say something different than the people before them. And there were usually 4 or 5 of them in the room at any given time. Again, their battalion commander's not there, brigade commander's not there, nobody else, just me and my aide who was taking notes. And then they had to give one improve. In other words, this is something that we have to address. It's screwed up. It's not going the way it should be. And this is what we think needs to be done to fix it. And we'd take that back. But again, then I would give them my email address. And I'd say, if there's ever something eating at you, it eats at me, because you, again, are our company commanders. You are translating big ideas at my level into concrete action at yours. You're a tactical leader who's carrying out actions that have strategic consequences. You have to understand what I'm trying to achieve, what I'm putting out, my guidance, and then you have to translate that into action outside the wire, under body armor with Kevlar weapon, and doing what only you can do. I can't do this, actually. You're engaging the enemy, sometimes lethally, kinetically, and you're engaging the population. And I would get, over time, as that email went out there, over many months, that was a 19.5-month tour for me, I would get 3 to 5 emails a week. And so you've created a culture, again, that welcomes this reasoned input, feedback, some often dissent, or at least challenging. So that's, I think, how you do this. It's something I obviously am a bit passionate about. I think it's very, very important. And I was very fortunate to have a lot of, if you will, off-the-wall assignments, to go to graduate school instead of to another infantry or ranger unit, to do a fellowship instead of the war college, then to do Haiti instead of the fellowship. These are out of your intellectual comfort zone experiences. They're what I think develops you most importantly. And in that, you value the kind of debate that is found at in those kinds of experiences.
So can I just grab that, Colonel?
Sure.
I'm saying general. I'm grabbing a kernel of great
KKR
advice, which is, yes, but that kernel was, as you thought about your career, and if you think about your leading an organization now, taking your talented people and asking them to do odd or offbeat or different or like some of your experiences. Is that something to take away?
Very much so. I had a boss. I was very, very fortunate, but I already had this inclination anyway. I was an infantry officer, but instead of going to the infantry captain's course, I said, I'd like to go to the armor captain. I'd just like to do something different. I'd like to learn about mounted warfare. I've been a light infantry paratrooper, platoon leader, and so forth. And they said, well, and I said, by the way, I already did the infantry one by correspondence. So I'd already completed it. I didn't need to do it. They said, okay, fine, you go to that. And again, this is often the case. I was told that I was committing professional suicide.
Well, I was about to say,
going to graduate school, instead of I was supposed to go to the Ranger Regiment. But I had a boss who said, Dave, have you ever considered raising your intellectual sights farther than the maximum effective range of an M60 machine gun? And I got the message. And he was a true soldier, scholar, statesman. I worked for him 3 times personally over the years as a 2-star, then he was a 4-star, and then he was a 4-star NATO commander, Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And we had an incredibly close relationship. It continued all the way beyond his death. I was the eulogist at his funeral, and I'd worked for him first as a captain when he was a 2-star. Lots of other people that he could have certainly selected to do that. And I felt very privileged to do that. But we wrote a lot. I was his speechwriter in my final assignment with him. And that really resonated with me. You should do something that does raise your intellectual sights. And for me, graduate school very much was an out of my intellectual comfort zone experience. I thought I was reasonably swift at that point in time. I'd actually just gone to the staff college, full academic year. I was number 1 in the class out of 1,200 students, and I was the youngest student in the class, one of only 8 captains, one of only 2 captains in history to be the number 1 in that particular course. So, the elevator went to the top floor on most days. And I found out that, and I thought I was a good writer. I'd published lots of articles and things. I learned much, much better how to communicate orally and in writing, how to reason, how to think. It was a hugely valuable experience. And above all, I learned there's a lot of people in the world who do not see it through the same prism that I do. And, years later, when I was in Iraq in the first tour after the invasion as a 2-star general commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division, we end up in northern Iraq where we weren't even supposed to go. And Geneva Convention, an occupying force commander, you're the executive, legislative, and judicial all in one. You are running that area. And we did it pretty well. Now, my experiences in Bosnia prior to that, Haiti, Central America, and so forth were very, very helpful, as was my academic research and just the inclination, the curiosity about counterinsurgency campaigns. But what really made the difference was this experience at graduate school, because I was prepared for people that didn't see the world, again, the same way that we did at all, who had practiced different religions, different sects within those religions, had tribes, had different political systems, legislative, judicial, all of this. And I think it helped enormously. And we actually sort of got it right. I mean, there was a recognition that, how come they're doing well, and it's really coming unglued in some other areas. And again, there are contextual differences and so forth, to be fair, but we very much didn't need guidance from Baghdad, and there wasn't a great deal coming in that early period. And so we just went on and got on with it, and had a bunch of talented brigade commanders and others. So that, I think, made a huge difference. And it's something that I think leaders should think about, is how do you do something that makes you intellectually uncomfortable, that takes you out of your intellectual comfort zone.
General Petraeus, first of all, I just want to thank you for serving our country. I mean, awesome job, for sure. Second thing I want to talk about is next week will be the 50-year anniversary of the Yom Kippur War in Israel. And, one of the outgrowths of that war, obviously, was the oil embargo on the U.S. And that's probably one of the, height of OPEC's dominance in crude oil markets. Fast forward today, and we have 13 million barrels of shale or, crude oil production in the U.S. The U.S. pretty much over the last 2, 3, 4 years has dominated global demand, supply markets. Well, now we're seeing that OPEC is now back in control. And I guess my question is like, what are the implications of them being back in control? And maybe what are some of the implications that, because it seems like Saudi and some of these other countries have now become bigger allies with China and Russia. What does that mean for you? Implications of that over the next,
Sure.
say decade or so.
Well, first of all, I think we should just recognize that the U.S. producing 13 million barrels of crude per day, which is just about the highest we've ever done. I think it's very close to it, is a result of some seriously big ideas and really technological advances that have only taken place in the United States, at least at scale. And this was, of course, it's founded on the invention of deep directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing, and then other like seismic, big data, and so forth. And of course, we also benefit from agile capital markets. We have lots of small and medium enterprises that can build out the capabilities that are needed to carry out this, to expand it very rapidly. We have reasonably good infrastructure for pushing it around. And above all, we have a legal regime that allows you to sell the minerals that are underneath land that you own, which is somewhat unique in the world as well. It's really interesting to recognize those factors and to understand why other parts of the world that have lots of shale gas and oil and tight rock have not been able to do what we have done. And yes, that increase in production truly has revolutionized energy markets. And you could see that. In fact, when I was the CI director, we had hit what we thought was peak oil. Remember, that was somewhere around 5.5 million barrels per day. And we saw what was happening when we were trying to predict the price of Brent crude, because the agency also has very good energy economists along with DOE and Treasury. And we built very sophisticated models for supply and demand. At the end of the day, that's what it is. All the different components and inputs, and then the factors that could influence that. And we typically got the prediction right, and others did not necessarily. And we watched, we realized what's going on here. Our production is going up, not down. And of course, it scaled from that low, if you will, which was thought to be peak oil by the best energy economists at the time, who didn't recognize this revolution that was taking place because of the three technological advances that I highlighted and the other factors that I enumerated. So, of course, that carried us. We completely disrupted markets. The power of OPEC seemed to go down. Of course, they also tried to put us out of business. That did not work. Remember back when oil was in the 30s, in that range. But what we do see now is a resurgence. Now, the other factors, though, are that it's a fairly tight market. We're roughly producing, again, you guys know far better than I do, but, just give or take 100 million barrels a day demand, roughly that in production. It's tighter than it has been for a number of years. And OPEC has made it tighter, but of course it's OPEC plus Russia. And so Russia has played along. And then you have the disruption of markets resulting from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Europe, by and large, the biggest consumers, at least Germany and others, not taking any Russian gas off the pipeline, very rapidly adapting, having to build regasification plants, et cetera. And then there's a number of other small factors that enter into this. Again, is Venezuela coming back or not? What's happening in Libya? They can give or take 500,000 barrels a day, depending on what's going on in that country. And there's still ongoing civil war. Is the Kurdish oil flowing out of northern Iraq? And we could walk our way around what's happening with Sudan and so forth. All of these in a tight market can actually have a somewhat disproportionate effect. And right now, of course, what we're seeing is the restriction by OPEC, in particular, as always, the Saudis, because they're the only ones that really keep a substantial amount off market. And then the Russians, some of which is their actions, some of which is, again, just market forces and some other issues that have led them to reduce some of the export and also some of the both crude and refined products. So that's where we are. And of course, there's a huge debate going on about whether we're seeing peak oil demand right now. I don't think we are, actually, or peak natural gas demand. I think that it will continue to grow, even as there is a massive transition over time to renewable sources of energy in a variety of different ways. Although some of that is still uncertain too, because even with some of the subsidies, wind power is going up in expense. There are issues involving the dependence on China for solar panels, on and on. You know these actually far better than I do. This is your life. But in that, now we see these new relations that you talk about. And while there still is a very, very close relationship between the United States and the Gulf states, including, of course, foremost among them, Saudi Arabia, nonetheless, there are new Saudi relations with China. There's even a little bit of a rapprochement going on with Iran and with the global South. India is emerging as a much more important player on the stage, but doing it in a way that even though they're in the Quad together with the US, Australia, and Japan, they're still also in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and they're going to expand that. And they're seeing themselves more and more. I was just there in the spring and saw this during the Trilateral Commission. I'm a member of that, where they are emerging as the representative of the global South, if you will. So a little bit of an outgrowth of the old non-aligned movement. And they are certainly buying Russian crude in very substantial quantities at quite a substantial discount. So all of these are new dimensions, new dynamics. And the job that we try to do at the KKR Global Institute is to understand the trends and at least understand the factors that will influence the direction of oil prices, gas prices, other commodities, and so forth. And that's the task. And of course, you then add in all of the new dynamics around the US and Western relationship with China, the restrictions on investing in China. Certain entities can't be invested in, dual use technologies cannot. You have the CHIPS executive order involving the high-end chips, 10 nanometers and below, intellectual property, fabrication plants, and the chips themselves. You have, again, just concerns about the surveillance state, all of these issues. And you have recognition by major corporations, Apple foremost among them, I think the biggest corporation in the world at this time, that they shouldn't have all of their manufacturing of components and then assembly of the end items in one region of one country, especially if it shuts down that entire region for a zero COVID policy. So now we have the idea of, again, diversification of manufacturing and assembly. India is a winner in that, South Vietnam, some others in Southeast Asia. You have the rise of the robots, which means that manufacturing is coming back to the US, but not with the hiring of the labor force. You have friendshoring, Mexico, a big beneficiary of that, although not quite as big because of some of the challenges that they face internally. And we have a recognition that supply chains can be disrupted after decades of practicing just-in-time logistics. Now we're actually having to resort to just-in-case logistics because they were disrupted by COVID and other issues recently. And we realize that we need more redundancy in the system. So now you're into warehouses again and all the rest of that. So I've laid out a number of factors, first in the energy space in particular, then in these geopolitical relationships that are emerging, and then just in other areas, all of which you have to factor in when you're trying to determine, is this a good sector? And above all, is this a good company in which you should invest? And I'll just remind the listeners, that the viewers, that KKR owns about 120 companies around the world. Many of them own other companies. And then we're a minority investor in another, say, 100 or more, managing about $520 billion around the world.
General, first of all, my thanks as well for being here. It is an honor to be with you today. First of all, we share your view on sort of an optimistic or oil and gas demand are likely to grow for the foreseeable future. So we may be trying to do new energy technologies, which we should do, but I think the old stuff's going to be used for quite a bit of time.
And we can make it cleaner too. And we are, I know, we're trying to restrict the methane, all of these different issues, so that especially in some of these, you can, yes, there's still fossil fuels. Yes, that still presents challenges as we're trying to transition, but this is going to be with us for a while. And we still need to run our cars. We still need to heat our houses. We still need to power manufacturing plants and all the rest of that.
Yes, sir. I have two technology-related questions or comments that sort of come towards the end of your book, which I thought were really fascinating. The first was the section where you talked first about Elon Musk, the noted entrepreneur, and Starlink making an impact in the Ukrainian situation, and the example of a leader, a billionaire tech leader having an impact on that conflict, and then the related element of TikTok videos of all things, something we decry I've got a teenage daughter, TikTok is the bane of my existence, but it apparently has helped win hearts and minds when people see the devastation, the travesty there. And then you have a leader like Zelensky, who is clearly knows how to harness new technologies. So there's something about existing Western world leaders and their ability to think beyond their sector. There's the use of technology, both in a very practical sense, but then also by other leaders. So if I tie that back to strategic vision, when I think about my traditional oil company CEOs and all the pressure they're under, especially in the US and Europe, there is some lesson in there for them. And I was hoping you could maybe expand on your thoughts.
Well, it is. And again, it brings us back to where we began, the tasks of a strategic leader. And the really interesting development here is that President Zelensky, who was, of course, an actor, a comedian, he played the president. He did it so well that he achieved real great fame in Ukraine and basically rode that to election on fervor about reforms. But frankly, the first 2 1/3 years he was in office, he got through some reforms, but his achievements were relatively modest. And I'm not sure you would have predicted on the basis of that he would emerge as such an extraordinary strategic leader as a wartime commander-in-chief. And yet that is what he has done. So again, get the big ideas right, communicate them, oversee the implementation, refine them, and do it again and again and again. First big idea, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. I'm staying in Kyiv. I'm not going to go to Lviv. My family's going to stay here. All Ukrainian men are going to stay in the country, even as women and children might need to seek refuge elsewhere if their communities, cities, and so forth, provinces are under pressure or occupied by Russians. And it just kept going on. His communication has been spectacular. Again, nuanced messages for each of the legislative bodies that of the major Western countries that are supporting so effectively. He overseen the implementation, truly inspirational. at the front, wearing the uniform, the example. All of this is just hugely impressive. And then constantly refining the big ideas and doing it again and again and again. So you see an example of a great strategic leader. And then on the other side, you see a leader who has been quite deficient in certain respects. I mean, Vladimir Putin, the big idea that you're going to walk into Kyiv, take it over in a couple of days, replace Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure and go home to a victory parade, that did not work out well. So vastly overinflated expectations of his own forces, which turned out to be far less capable than most thought was the case. And then completely underestimated how the Ukrainians would respond, not just the military forces, but the Ukrainian people who are fighting their war of independence in their eyes. For their very survival. They're all committed. The entire nation is mobilized. He has not mobilized Russia anywhere near in that fashion. Certainly generating additional forces, has the advantage of 3.5 times the population, many times more that the economy, thanks to oil in particular, but also gas, coal, some other commodities, fertilizer-related industries. So you see the contrast in strategic leadership. I don't want to be unfair to the Russian forces. They have put in an extraordinary defense after losing all the battles after the very first weeks in the south. You know, they lost the Battle of Kyiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv Oblast, Kherson, but they have put in a very, very formidable defense in the south that is causing major challenges. And the Ukrainians had to change their big idea of how they're going to try to crack that. Instead of armored formations, infantry squads, 150 meters a day, tree line to tree line. So you see this here, and I think that's very impressive. And you see now this, one of the real modern features of this battlefield that we've never seen before is what you described earlier. First of all, it's really smartphones that can capture pictures, video, and so forth. Then it's the presence, the access to the internet. That's what's facilitated by Elon Musk's Starlink in particular, but also other forms. And then it's the availability of social media sites, TikTok among them, but also many others, onto which you can upload videos, photos, data, stories, and so forth. So there's a degree of transparency here that has never been present on a battlefield before. But you also have the tools which adept leaders can use very effectively to convey their message, to convey the reality. And that's what you highlighted. And Zelensky has done this again, pitch perfect and very, very impressively, much more so than Putin, though we should note that within the Russian Federation, Putin's control of the news media is absolute, the TV, if you will. And that's what most more of the elder get their news from. And they're trying to take more control of social media in internet service providers as well. So this is one of the really transformed elements of this particular battlefield. And it is something we have not seen before, even as we look at Ukraine and see almost World War I-like defenses, Cold War vintage armored vehicles, but now also increasingly sophisticated unmanned systems, some of which are remotely piloted, and others are now actually algorithmically piloted. There's no human in that loop once it's launched, other than perhaps to press a button that says that when you meet the conditions, you can take the kinetic or non-kinetic action that you've been programmed to carry out. So it's a fascinating battlefield, and that, you know, a tragic, horrible, terrible losses. I was just there again 3 weeks ago, having been there 3 months before that. It's very tough. It's going to be a long war unless there's a collapse of the Russian forces, which is not impossible, but perhaps not the base case. But studying this does give us a lot of insights about what could come in the future. We don't think, my co-author Andrew Roberts and I don't think that this is the future of war, but it has a lot of signposts to what the future of war may be if we don't deter it. And of course, the big idea there is we need to transform our forces, especially in the Indo-Pacific, so there's no thought each morning that this might be the day to carry out a particular offensive action.
Well, General, that's fantastic. That gets to the second part of my question around technology, which is sort of the nature of warfare, which you allude to again, towards the latter chapters of the book. And, you know, as an American, I've never worried that I'm going to be attacked in my country. And I also know, and perhaps it's from working on Wall Street, that we benefit as Americans from the economic security that comes from American military strength around the world. Yet you have some really interesting observations, not just about drones, but in the future, robots and AI. And will that allow countries who may not have our military strength to punch above their weight and not just cause the annoying problems that I think drones cause, but to really have a counter army? And maybe that's many decades in the future, but it does seem like it's coming. It sounded like it seemed like it's some pretty interesting comments about that in the book.
Well, there certainly will be, again, just complete revolution in the systems that are available. Really, first for the most high-end countries, you have to have a certain level of resources, obviously technology, capacity, expertise, capability to design and to use these systems. But the truth is that many, many dozens, I think it's actually almost 100 countries now have drones of some type. Now, they range from very unsophisticated off-the-shelf drones to the much more sophisticated ones that we have used in the US military. But again, this is going to continue to proliferate. And the real big development that's coming, I think, is going to be as we transform from a small number of very large platforms, which are incredibly capable, but also incredibly expensive and vulnerable to the enemy. Hard to defend. You can defend them. We will. But again, you have to be worried about aircraft carriers, other surface combatants, main battle tanks, major fighter bombers, and so forth. And gradually over time, we're going to have fewer of those and a vastly greater number of smaller unmanned systems that will, again, either be remotely or increasingly algorithmically piloted, where the human in the loop is the person who designs the algorithm, establishes the conditions that the machine meets, which, by the way, it can meet better than we can with facial recognition, gait recognition, voice recognition, a variety of other forms, again, of machine learning and AI-enabled systems. And by the way, these aren't just going to be in the air. They're going to be on the surface of the sea, on the ground, subsurface, which is particularly challenging because you don't always have access to GPS, needless to say, in outer space, and also, of course, in cyberspace, where there really are already lots of, quote, unmanned systems. There's lots of, again, algorithms working there on a daily basis, trying to attack and penetrate our most sensitive networks to collect from them, analyze them, and all the rest of this. And these will all be linked with unbelievable sensors, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms of various types and capabilities, again, in all domains as well, including in cyberspace. And the genius is going to be able to pull it all together, to take sensor to shooter, to do it very, very rapidly. But at the end of the day, what we want to do is make this transformation so swift, so impressive, so compelling to would-be adversaries that they don't think about ever challenging it. They realize that this would be a losing proposition. And that's what we need. We cannot allow what is a severe competition, in the words of our national security advisor, for the relationship between the US and China and other Western countries as well. Because keep in mind, again, the EU has its issues there. All the countries of Southeast Asia, the Indo-Pacific have various issues also. But we cannot allow that to turn into conflict. That would be catastrophic for the entire world. You can de-risk, and we did de-risk Ukraine and Russia. We did it after 2014. We did it months prior to the latest invasion in 2022. It's pretty hard to de-risk the global economy blowing up because the top two countries in that economy, in that world, might end up in an actual conflict. And I think we can do this. I think we have to do it. And I actually think we will do it. And we're in the process of doing it, but we need to accelerate the process. Needless to say, there are vested interests that resist some of this, and we have to work our way through that. In fact, as I mentioned before we came on, I was just at the ceremony that honored the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, and then recognized the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General C.Q. Brown, and his message was we have to accelerate this process of transformation.
So, General, it's going to be very hard to let you go because we're enjoying this so much, but we are getting close. I know you've been very generous with your time. Maybe a last question, because Arjun touched on it, which is the U.S. military has been such a superior organization for, I guess, really going back 40 plus years since we rebuilt it after Vietnam. What would you tell us is the state of today's U.S. military, the outlook? I think we were all, every American citizen, particularly participants in the Afghan campaign, were sad to see how it ended. We've done ourselves some damage, it feels like. What's the state of the U.S. military? What's the outlook? What should we be doing to improve its readiness in the next decade?
Well, first of all, I share your perspective on Afghanistan. I am completely non-political. I don't even register to vote, much less support candidates of either party, and candidates of either party, and actually members of Congress and the executive branch of either party seek my thoughts from time to time, and I testify fairly regularly, et cetera. But I just want it noted that I don't come at it from a perspective of one or the other parties. I felt that we had alternatives to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I thought it was wrong for the previous administration to agree to that agreement with the Taliban, which gave them everything they wanted, even insisted on the Afghan government, which we didn't allow at the negotiating table, to force them to give up 5,500 detainees who went right into the fight that helped to collapse Afghan forces. There were ways we could have improved how we came out of there, needless to say, as well. But above all, I just felt that we had a strategy that was certainly not satisfactory in many ways. It was frustrating. It was maddening. Our partners were very imperfect, et cetera. But keeping 3,500 troops on the ground where we hadn't taken a loss in 18 months cost us maybe $25 billion a year to sustain something that I think clearly was far, far better than what has transpired as the Taliban toppled it and have come back in power and basically, excommunicated 50% of the population from participating in the economy and society, et cetera, education, high school and college and so on, and then many other elements of an ultra-conservative sort of 8th or 9th century interpretation of Islam. And of course, the Al-Qaeda senior leader was found there right near the presidential palace within weeks or months of the Taliban takeover. Be that as it may, and I do think that did have implications. I think it was one of the factors that Vladimir Putin considered when he was trying to size up how will the U.S. respond if we invade Ukraine, how will Europe respond? There's some others, a red line that wasn't a red line, some less than as forceful as we might have been to the 2014 actions by Russia and Ukraine, South China Sea, and others. These do have repercussions, implications, reverberations throughout the world. I do think, however, we've responded very impressively. The U.S. has led NATO and the rest of the world. It's kept it together. $44 billion of security assistance is a colossal amount. It has enabled Ukraine to achieve what it has together with what has been provided by our NATO and other Western partners. And that has gone very well. There's some decisions I'd like to have seen made faster, but by and large, the U.S. has very much led the world on this in this particular case. The U.S. military has performed magnificently in that. Yes, we're not on the battlefield, but we are supplying, we're supporting, we're repairing, maintaining, training, equipping, and so forth, the Ukrainians in every way that we can without boots on the ground. And keep in mind that this is a great investment. I mean, with 3% of our defense budget, as Senator McConnell has often observed, the Ukrainians have basically taken down 50% of Russia's tank fleet, and they're eating away more of it every day, which reduces the threat that existed previously to NATO. And of course, ironically, Vladimir Putin set out to make Russia great again. What he's really done is make NATO great again. He's the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War, and no one has done more for the cause of Ukrainian nationalism more than he has either. The state of our military, though, I think is exceptional. Each of the chairmen today in this ceremony and the President of the United States and Secretary of Defense noted this is not just the best military in the world, it's the best in our history. That said, there are some challenges. There's clearly recruiting challenges for the Army Navy, and Air Force. The Marines will be the only service, but they're the smallest that will meet their recruiting goals this year. Although interestingly, re-enlistment has been quite solid. So we've got to address that. Part of that is, of course, the historic low unemployment. It's the reduction in the number of young men and women in America who can qualify for service, either physically, mentally, academically, and so forth. So we have to make adjustments to that. The propensity to serve is down. The fact that we're literally not in war, I think actually we didn't have these challenges during the war years. I think people felt the privilege of performing a mission larger than self very deeply during that period. In fact, I presided over the largest re-enlistment ceremony in history in the war zone in Baghdad on the 4th of July, 2008, 1,215 men and women in uniform. Again, I think the largest in our history. So this is an extraordinary group of individuals in our nation's uniform, but we do have to solve the enlistment challenge that does exist, the recruiting challenge. I think we can work our way through that. And then above all, I'd come back to what I stressed earlier. We have to transform this force more rapidly, noting that we still have to engage. We're still going after certain elements of Islamist extremists. We are still having to deter North Korea. We still have to deal with Russia, in addition to what we have to do relative to China and then other countries like Iran and a number of other issues that are out there, including in cyberspace, where you have nation states, criminals, extremists, and even individuals all carrying out nefarious actions as well. So the U.S. right now, I think, is keeping more plates spinning at any given time since arguably the end of World War II, noting that we do have allies and partners, which our potential adversaries don't have, to help them do that. But it's a very daunting task, and it means we must have capabilities throughout the spectrum of conflict, all the way up to the high end, where that transformation has to be accelerated that I've discussed earlier. And I think that's the critical element to moving forward to ensuring that deterrence remains very strong, noting there are two elements to deterrence. It's the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other. We have to transform the capabilities and ensure that there's never any doubt in the mind of a potential adversary that we're willing to employ them if that is necessary, and that we will prevail in that case as well. So I guess that's how I would give the state of the military, echoing again what the outgoing chairman, the incoming chairman, their commander-in-chief and secretary of defense emphasized today, but noting again, forthrightly, I hope, that there are challenges out there. We have to address these challenges. We have to remain a learning organization. We have to create a culture in which reasoned and principled dissent, suggestions, recommendations are brought forward and are welcomed. And all of those are the elements that will enable us to continue to succeed in our missions and continue to maintain what really is the most extraordinary fighting force in world history.
Well, you've done what was so clear throughout the book, worked for leaders, which is you talk about it directly. What's good, you call good. What's not working, you say it's not working. You just lay it out there, and it's that kind of leadership that's going to fix so many problems. We're so lucky to get to spend an hour with you. I would echo what Mike and Arjun said. We're just as patriotic Americans honored. And thank you, and thank all our friends. We're very privileged to get to do this. So thank you.
Privilege has been mine, man. Really great to be with each of you, and great to be able to communicate through this means with those who will watch this.
Yes, sir.